Welcome to my class. My name is Mimi Perot, and I am going to be your professor for this online endeavor. I'm still trying to figure out some of the kinks with teaching you guys online, and so I would appreciate some grace in that process. Like I said, I've taught this class at the undergraduate level, and I'm really glad to be teaching it at the graduate level with our certificate program. One of the things I think is really important as a student is that you think about how you're going to learn, and you orient yourself in a way that allows you to learn the most possible from a course. And so I always start by giving my students some tips on note-taking and critical thinking and listening, because I think that in the world we live in today, it's really easy to get distracted by other things that are going on. And I think also that by using a computer, sometimes we get distracted. So I'm going to walk through this Prezi with some tips for note-taking and critical thinking and listening, and talk about how that relates to the course that we're taking this semester. Also, just a reminder, you want to make sure that you bring your syllabus contract or fill out the Google form by this next week. I think our date is the 29th. I think that's the following Tuesday. So just make sure that you get that turned in. I think the Google form is the easiest way for you guys to complete that. So first of all, why is note-taking valuable? I want you to consider these three terms. The first one is discrimination. The second one is comprehension, and the third is evaluation. And one of the things that we learn in educational research is that you need to, your brain goes through the process of three things in order to commit something to memory. And those three things have been kind of labeled discrimination, comprehension, and evaluation. So I wanted to kind of walk through the process that your brain goes through in thinking about that. First of all, this is an example of discrimination. You can look at this group of apples and determine from what you see that some of the apples are different than others, right? So there's one red apple and there are several green apples. We know that these apples don't taste the same, right? Granny Smith apples taste a certain way, and Red Delicious apples taste a certain way. I'm more of a Granny Smith person. My husband really likes red apples. So, if he goes shopping, he's going to buy red apples. And if I go shopping, I'm going to buy green apples. So that's really important to know. But it's not just about the color here. It's also about the taste. It's about kind of how that fits into the story I just told you, the purpose of these apples, right? So there's lots of things that go along with trying to group things into different groups. The next thing we have to think about is comprehension. And probably when you were a kid, you took a reading comprehension test just to see how much you retained from the reading. So comprehension is really important because we want to think about not just what we're reading, but what are the main ideas of what we're reading, what are the main topics, what's the thesis statement in what we're reading. And all of those things are important to consider when you're reading a reading or even listening to a lecture. A lot of people just take notes down as they learn, but they never revisit those notes and group them in a way that allows them to retain or comprehend what's going on. In Spanish, the word comprende means to comprehend or to understand. So it's really important for us to understand that unless we can process that, not just in the moment, but later, we probably are not going to retain as much knowledge that we need to. And then the third thing is evaluation. And a lot of us think about evaluation being like, how am I being evaluated? Am I being evaluated on what I've learned and what I haven't learned? So it's really important to think about in our process of learning, what are we taking away from what we're learning? And this needs to be a cyclical process. So, when you're taking notes, and a professor says something, or I say something about crisis communication, you should always be thinking, how does this relate to my personal stance or my career field or my career goals or even the current circumstances I'm in? Because this personal evaluation will help you to kind of link the information that we get and connect it to the things that you're learning throughout the course. So again, those three terms are discrimination, comprehension, and evaluation. A lot of people ask me, how does a person engage in a topic or become critical? I'm going to give you guys a couple seconds just to think about what that means to you. And I want you to think about critical thinking. So just jot down really quick on a piece of paper what it means to engage in something or become critical. So when we think of the word engage, I often think of the word engagement. So an engagement, you have an engagement, you have an obligation, you have a relationship with a person, where you've committed to that. So in order to understand information, we have to actually think about forming a relationship with that information, thinking about how that relationship, how that information relates to other things in our lives. You can just take a college class and commit things to memory, but unless you actually think about how that relates to your life and your circumstances and your life moving forward, it's not really going to benefit you in any way. It's just going to be something you complete for course credit. Also, how do we become critical? And I think the word critical sometimes gets a bad rep, like, don't be so critical of me. My daughter says that, Mom, don't be so critical of me. But I think, critical comes from the word critique, but it also comes from the word crit, right? And crit means to read something and apply it. And so by becoming critical, we mean in the sense, reading something and applying it to what we're learning. Note-taking can help you to not just commit things to memory, like I said, in that process of of discrimination, comprehension, and evaluation, but also to do these things. It helps you to engage in a sort of professionalism about the topic. It also will allow you to think of possible solutions. Another thing that note-taking is really good for is this whole idea of engaging in empathy. And you hear in the news all the time, whenever something bad happens in the news, people say, well, people just weren't practicing empathy. They couldn't really put themselves in the shoes of other people. And I think a lot of times this is because people are not listening to what other people are saying. I think to really, truly listen, you have to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the other person. And so if you're not going through that process of discrimination, comprehension and evaluation, you're not really able to engage in empathy. And, we're not supposed to be robots. We're supposed to actually connect to whatever we're learning with our human emotions and what we're dealing with. So that's really important to think about. I think this becomes really important with crisis communication because while some of the case studies we're going to look at, you haven't actually participated in something or experienced something like that. It's important for you to understand kind of the situation of the people in that case study, to kind of be able to apply that. And so I think it's important to think about that. The next thing is to come up with possible applications, so how does this information apply to me? You can't really learn that unless you are actually, you're actually going through a process of applying it to you some way, right? And one of the purposes of learning stuff at a graduate level is to be able to form some sort of expertise in a certain field. And so one of the things I want you to do as students in my course is to think about possible ways as we're moving through this that you could apply the knowledge right now where you're working in your career field that will benefit you and make you better at what you're doing. And then the last thing that we need note-taking for is to consider improvements. A lot of times we're going to see things that people did stupidly wrong. And we really need to have some way to relate to that and think about kind of what's going on and think about how that relates to the case studies. 3 traits of professionalism. Professionalism comes from knowledge, skills, and character. And I just want to touch on these really quick. So knowledge is going to be all the content you learn in this class. We're also going to learn some skill sets. We're going to learn how to create crisis plans. We're going to have some training that we do for FEMA. There's some documents that I'm going to ask you to read through and kind of think about. And then I think also those things impact your character as an individual. One of the things that I've been told in a lot of professional circles I've worked in is that you could be the smartest person in the world, but if you're a jerk and you don't really know how to work with people well, no one's going to want to hire you, right? Yeah, I've been on several job interviews where, after I got the job, people were just like, "You're such a nice person." The other guy, he was okay, but you're just a really nice person, and that's what really stood out to us. So I think that if you have the right knowledge and you're confident enough in what you're learning because you've been through this note-taking process and this committing to memory process, that really can benefit your character, because then you're more confident in who you are and you're willing to share that information with others in a way that's kind and not overbearing, or not second guessing yourself. And so in communication in the field, knowledge can make or break your response to a crisis. And so therefore, good note-taking practices can commit cases to memory and help you to apply that knowledge in a crunch. All I'm saying is please take notes and be prepared to take down notes as we are working through this. I'm going to give you a couple notes, a couple pointers for how to take down notes now. So we talked about note-taking being valuable because of discrimination, comprehension, and evaluation. And so one of the things that's a key element to all of these concepts is it's not about me as the teacher telling you information and you copying it down, but the thing that's really central to all of these things is you listening, you going through the process of discrimination, you going through the process of comprehension, you going through the process of evaluation as an individual student or learner. I am going to interpret things differently. The way that I present things is based off of my personal experience and knowledge that I've obtained. So it's important when I present this information that you think about how you relate to the information and not necessarily how I'm relating to it. Although, my experiences can be useful for your learning experience, you also have to think about how that relates to you as an individual. And this takes you listening and so one of the things I say when you're taking notes, you have to think critically, you have to take notes, you have to write things down. Actually, 90% of the information that we get, we can't remember unless we have some sort of physical action to go along with it. And that's why note-taking is so important, because it's the actual process of writing something down. You have that rote kind of involvement. You remember the movement of your hand, and that connects with your brain. And then the third thing is it's really important to listen. Just because you know things doesn't mean you know everything. I have this experience with my 6-year-old daughter sometimes. She's so funny. She will be like, "Mommy, you don't know where you're going." And I'll be like, "Well, do you know where you're going?" And she'll say, "No, but I know that you don't know, that you're not going the right way. I think I could drive us there." And I said, "Well, would you like to hear where we're going? And I can tell you how to get there." And so I'll walk her through the process of where we're going, like driving to school or home or wherever, grocery store, wherever we're going. And then the next day, she'll ask me the very exact same question about going to the same place. She wasn't listening. Listening is so important, because in order to know where you're going, you have to follow the directions. And so I'm going to give you pointers about things. I'm going to talk about certain things. But unless you're listening, you're not going to be able to commit that stuff to memory. I like to give students these note-taking examples. So this is a really cool thing. This is some visual note-taking things. This is from a South by Southwest in 2010. There's a person who was talking about visual note-taking. And so this is an example of how that person could relate to note-taking. So here you can see there's pictures, there's different little diagrams and things like that. And this is not necessarily the way that I learn, but I think that some of you might benefit from taking notes in this way as well. So this is kind of cool. This article had 10 basic skills that you need for visual note-taking. It has a lot to do with drawing stories and shapes and writing legibly. That's really important at any time of note-taking. If you don't write legibly, you can't revisit your notes and understand what you're saying. Also, supporting the text with icons and imagery and using symbols. Also, you notice here, they say listen and prioritize relevant points. So, sometimes when you're taking notes chronologically, you might not actually get that. So it's sometimes good to create different columns or different areas that are for different priorities, right? So the most important things, like, go in a certain part of the page, where the least important things maybe go at the bottom of the page. Also, here's a note-taking checklist I give to my students, because I think it's really important. After a lecture, you want to make sure you review assignments using active reading. So you want to look over what we talked about, and you want to actively read. Active reading just means you're reading the sentence, you're thinking about what it means. You want to list and look up unfamiliar terms or concepts. Most of the time, these are going to come from the readings, so you just go back to the readings. Or you want to use Google and figure out what a word means. Maybe there's a Latin part of it, or there's something that we're talking about that you're like, oh, I've never heard that word used that way. You want to make sure you go and figure out what the definition is of it. List questions to ask or points where clarification is needed. This is really important, especially if you want to exceed in this course. You really should do that so that you have discussion questions when we post on our discussion forum to ask your classmates, as well as answer yourself. Note difficult portions of the text. Maybe there's things you don't understand, and you might need to revisit later. Put notes in the appropriate notebook or section. Make sure you have some sort of organization to the notes you're taking. I like to put all of my notes in one book, and that book has everything in it that I need. It has all my class notes, because if I have multiple places, it gets hard for me to locate those. But I always, at the top of the page, put the date, and I put where I took the notes, and if somebody was speaking, I put that at the top too. Begin each set with a new dated and numbered page. Use abbreviations, but when you use abbreviations, make sure you understand what your abbreviations mean. Some people like to create kind of an abbreviation index at the back of their book that has, different things mean different abbreviations mean different things. So you have your own little glossary that helps. Put your notes in your own words. Don't just copy down what's on the slide word for word. Think about, well, if I was going to restate this, how would I restate this? I'll give you a couple examples of that in a second. And then also keep your notes brief. Use the coding scheme that you've developed. So, if certain things about crisis communication theory are going to be highlighted, just make sure you're consistent with that. Locate missing information. And check your text and references to clarify a lecture. So after you hear what I say, you might want to go back and revisit your readings. This is especially important with graduate school level work. Number items are distinguished between major or minor points. Look, listen for word cues and other things that might be highlighted, and then review your lecture notes within 24 hours. This is really important because you might forget little nuances or things if you don't go back and review your lecture notes. And then check for errors and omissions when you're doing that. The other thing I like to talk about is these 6 critical questions. If you're from a journalism or public relations background, you're going to understand that these are really important. I had a student who was in, military studies, and he said these are really important as well. So critical questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how, or what I call the 5 W's and H. Who said it? What did they say? Where did they say it? When did they say it? Why did they say it? How did they say it? Okay, so those are all really important things that you should know by the time you're done reading something or you're, listening to a lecture. I posted the multitasking video based on research by Clifford Nass. He's out of Stanford. One of the things that's really important is when you are listening to lectures in this class, I know you want to multitask, and it's really easy to just open another tab and start surfing on Facebook while you're listening, but you really should try to give it 100% of your attention. There are lots of challenges that multitasking presents. One of them is the fact that your brain really can't focus on more than one thing at once. So, if you're splitting your brain's attention on multiple things, you're going to retain only a certain percent of what you're looking at. The best type of interaction with content is interaction that allows you to go through that, discrimination, comprehension, and evaluation process. And also engage your brain and emotions while you're interacting with the content. Interruptions will break your concentration and make it harder for you to retain information. And I can tell you, as someone who has a 7-month-old child, you know, there are things, you know, whenever I might be working on something and then I get distracted trying to take care of my child, and I come back and I usually have to backtrack about like 3 steps to get back to where I was when I stopped. You know, that's hard to do when you have multiple things going on. So it's really important to try to give the course an uninterrupted time. And this goes back to scientific stuff about 6 factors for flow. You want intense and focused concentration on the present moment, because if you don't have that, it's really difficult for you to retain that information. Merging of action and awareness, a loss of a reflective self-consciousness, a sense of personal control or agency over the situation or activity, a distortion of temporal experience when subjective experience of time is altered, and experience of the activity as intrinsically rewarding, also referred to as autotelic response. And these are all things that they talk about in that video and research done by Clifford Nace. I put a picture of a tent here because I think it's really good to think about, you know, our process of learning like pitching a tent. If you don't put the tent up in the right order, you basically have to start all over from the very beginning. And if you're not paying attention to the directions, it's really hard to assemble that tent, right? I kind of like this picture also because I think it's missing the cover that goes over it in the rain. And so sometimes we, in crisis communication, we think about following things in a certain way that it's been done before, but we forget about the fact that there is a process to follow that's going to most benefit our experience. So, you know, if it's not raining outside, this tent setup is perfectly fine. But if it starts to rain, you really have to think about setting your tent up in a different way. So just some reminders: be prepared, shut up and listen, okay? Listening will allow you to practice empathy, which is really important on being able to relate to content. It also helps you get the person's names or the dog's names right. You know, I say the dog because like sometimes, you know, it's not the person that's the most important. It might be the location, or it might be other things about the story that you need to get right. And, you know, people often have names that are spelled similarly, and it can make a difference in how you understand concepts. You can also really embarrass yourself if you get stuff wrong about people's names. So I'm going to go ahead and apologize if I misspell anybody's name. You guys let me know. You can recognize traps or rabbit holes. You know, you might get really interested in something, but it might have nothing to do with, you know, that process of discrimination, comprehension, and retention. So also, brevity is best. Think about writing something like a tweet. You want to write it in a way that if you were to tweet it, you could remember it. I say either tweet or a note card. Your brain can't remember a whole lot of information, so it's best to remember it in small, short sentences. Also, acknowledge all the parties involved and their responses. So knowing all the who's and all the where's and all the what's involved is important. Think about what's the most important. Don't copy things down word for word, like I said, unless they're specifically important. And I will always tell you when I'm saying something, you need to know this definition, or you need to know this. You should copy it down word for word. Otherwise, you want to write it in a way that you can understand it the best. Your brain can't remember all that. Okay, so we're going to do an exercise here. I want you to watch this video and then write down what is said in this video or covered in this video in 108 characters or less. So basically, what would fit on a note card or in a tweet.
Then when was the moment caliber when you absolutely were bitten? Once I started, I worked damn hard. I did the same thing in 52 as I'm now doing. It may not be successful. Start early, try to get the support of non-professionals who are much more ready to commit themselves to it. It's just long labor. Why early? Why? Why do it? Why do you do it now? Why do you go all this effort? Obviously, you were a well-to-do guy that lived off the fat of the land. Why do you go into politics? Find the rewards first. What are they? Well, look now, you went to law school. I don't know law, which I was going to be went to law school, and then I go into the and I'm dealing with some dead, deceased man's estate. Or I'm perhaps fighting a divorce case, or even a case one kind or another, or an accident. You compare that, or let's say more serious work, you're participating in the case against the Duke Hunt. In general, a trust case, which takes 2 or 3 years. You tell me that compares interest in the Congress, the right of labor, make a speech in foreign policy. And I just think that there's no comparison. Whereas everybody reaches a natural level, across the more natural level in the Senate. There isn't anybody in the House that would not like to advance themselves. Anybody who works for anything, my God, if you didn't have that power of desire, the United States and any place else would collapse. That's what moves the country, the world. That's just a part of it. I'm just saying that it's the center of power, not power. I mean, I'm not talking about person. I'm just saying the center of action, precisely the president. Now, if you're interested, many people are, not just me. The presidency is me, anything done.
So this video is about John F. Kennedy's conversation with a friend of his named Cannon when he was deciding to run for president in January of 1960. And so one of the basic things you want to remember is that basically we need to know what happened. So a shorter statement about what happens in this video is President John F. Kennedy, you know, he's the main person, but he's not a president at this time. So John F. Kennedy had a conversation about making a broader impact with his friend Cannon, which led to him deciding to run for president in January of 1960. So that's a really short version of what all the information that was said here in 2 minutes and 45 seconds. So try your hardest to summarize what's said in 108 characters or less. You know, those kind of things are really easy for us to commit to. And I think of this in social media as well. You know, that's kind of how we think of things, is in short spurts of information. You need to be able to commit to memory enough where you can apply it. Think about what was the event discussed, who was involved, where did it take place, when was it, and why was it relevant? Why is the study valuable? What can we learn from the success/mistakes of the communicators involved? And so all of those things are really important when we're talking about crisis communication. When you're going through your reading and you're reading case studies, that would be a great way to approach what you're reading. The other thing you want to look for is those terms. Like I said, those terms are really important. So thinking about why is it relevant, you know, if it relates to a certain term or a certain theory, that would be one of the reasons it's relevant. Here's the note-taking checklist again, just to remind you, think about how you take notes. Like I said, I run through this because I never assume that anybody knows how to take notes anymore. And I think it can be really intimidating when you have a lot of reading. So I always start off my classes with this kind of help for students. And one more point. There's no shame in asking someone to restate something, but don't be rude about it. Make sure you listened in the first place. So I'll definitely answer any of your questions, but make sure that you listen to the lecture in its entirety and you've done all the reading before you come up with questions that I might need to repeat. This is also why we'll have open question forums. So if one student asks it, I can answer it there, and then you can read what other students have asked and get the information that you need. Again, some visual note-taking examples. Really great way to think about note-taking. in a more creative guise than you might have thought about in the future and might want to try in the future. Thank you for listening to our note-taking lecture. I'm looking forward to having you in class.